put on by the Middle East Policy Forum and brought to you with the generous support of ExxonMobil. Today we have a really fascinating and I think timely event, an area of the region that we probably don't talk enough about here at the Elliott School, and that is Libya's elections, a transition to democracy. And we have a really great panel coming to us from around the world, or at least around Europe and the States. On our panel today, Dr. Lamis Ben Saad, political activist and member of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, as well as assistant professor at the University of Tripoli. We also have Mary Fitzgerald, a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute, associate fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College London, and an associate fellow at the Institute for International Political Studies. Tarek Megarisi, a senior policy fellow with the North Africa and Middle East program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And discussing today, we have our moderator, Sarah Yerkes, who is senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I should introduce myself. I'm Graham Cornwell, assistant dean for research at the Elliott School and director of the Policy Forum. And I'm delighted to have you. Just a couple housekeeping notes. Please put your questions in the chat, and we will share them with our moderator and get them to the panelists. And then secondly, just a big thank you to Rachel Schaefer, who kind of runs the show at the Policy Forum, for helping put this together. And without further ado, Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. So Libya, there's a lot going on in Libya, and I think when we first this event, we thought we would be discussing the outcomes of the elections. The elections were originally scheduled for December 24th. Let me start with you, Tarek, and ask you what happened. Why have they been postponed? Kind of talk us through how we got from December 24th to today.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks very much for inviting me to be here today. It's kind of a big question because, we say that the elections are postponed, that we should have been talking about what the result of the elections was, but for the few months building up to the actual election day or to vote day itself, I think it became increasingly clear to all of us watching, in detail what was going on, that this vote would simply just never work. I mean, eventually the entire electoral process collapsed under the weight of its inadequacies or of its own paradoxes, rather than just an election day was missed. Because when you go to that actual election day itself, when you go to the ballot box and so on, a lot of work goes into making that happen, right? Not just the organizational and the logistical side of having that ballot and having that vote and counting the votes, but also in making the electoral law that governs it, in organizing what the election is for, creating a mandate for a government, etc., etc. And none of these things really existed in any consensual or mutually agreed upon fashion in Libya in the build-up to election day. You have in Libya a political elite that in some form or another have been in power for most of the last decade now. This vote was meant to get rid of them, and so instead of elegantly retiring through a democratic vote, they tried to exploit Libya's political immaturity, Libya's democratic immaturity, to ensure that either they can dominate the electoral process and corrupt it to ensure that they stay in power and they profit from it, or that the whole thing would simply collapse. And so we had an electoral law produced unilaterally by the Speaker of the Parliament. And that was not only kind of a political gambit, but technically speaking or legally speaking, was a pretty poor law, which meant that it kind of opened the floodgates for over 90 individuals to apply to become president, and a very poor system of vetting to try and cut that down. So, by the time we got close to election day, we had many people across the country claiming that the elections were illegitimate because the law that was governing it were clearly designed to favor candidates who they would argue should be disqualified on moral grounds, let alone political qualifications. And for those who did want to go ahead with it, they simply weren't sure how to do it. There were so many candidates. Some people were saying that they were disbarred. Others were saying that no, actually the court's rulings are illegitimate and it should go ahead. And so there was a great deal of confusion, least of all over what exactly this government was intended to do, what this president was intended to do. And so instead of having a clarifying experience on the 24th of December, Libya really just descended into confusion and ever greater confusion. And that seems to be the trajectory that it's carrying on today. But thanks very much, Sarah. I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Great, thank you so much. Let me turn it over to you, Lamis. Could you describe how women's engagement has been going during the in the political process in Libya today? Could the elections potentially bring about greater gender equality within the Libyan political arena? Oh, are you there, Lamis? No, okay. Well, let me then, sorry, it looks like we're having some issues. Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Sarah. And I really appreciate the invitation. Okay, so for women in Libya, downs. Women's participation in decision-making positions in the transitional period is really difficult, and it's dangerous. Women have faced, physical threats, murder, kidnapping, sexual harassment, abuse, and all of this has led to drawback of women's participation, especially after the assassination of prominent activists like Salwa al-Bukhari, Fariha al-Barqawi. So all of this has accumulated and it's led to the drawback. However, there is a bright side. Women have been insisting on their rights to be involved in the public sphere. And we have witnessed female-led involvement and female-led organizations in peace building. But unfortunately, all of these female-led efforts didn't reflect in the official participation in the formal structures, or they're not reflected as decision makers. We had two elections on our previous democratic elections, which took place in 2012 and in 2014. Parliamentary seats were only the percentage was 16%, and then only two ministers were in each of the governments, that is the previous two governments. So women still have to worry about their being neglected and about their marginalizations. Women still need to advocate for meaningful inclusion to promote, the country's transition. Yet there is another bright side, is that in the UN peace process, which brought out the roadmap, which I have contributed to, it has been stipulated in the roadmap that the women's participation has to be 30%. And yet, despite that, the government of national unity, only 5 women have been appointed as ministers. So that quota wasn't respected, and it wasn't implemented. And unfortunately, now we have an electoral law which also embarks 32 seats, 32 out of 200 seats for women. So the percentage is still stick to the 16%. Yet, we still see, because now the electoral process, it has begun. and we still see a strong determination of women to go through to elections. For example, the constituency of Tripoli, which I am competing for as a candidate for the parliaments. I am competing against 100 more, candidates. So here, this is a positive indication, or it's a good indication that there is a strong will from women to be active or to be engaged in the political process, despite that the legal framework is so weak. I hope, this is it.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Over to you, Mary. Can you talk us through the role of the international community in pushing for these elections to be held on time? Been the biggest players in pushing for the elections, and why do you think that is?
Thank you very much, Sarah. Well, since the December 24th election date was set in late 2020, there was such a push. It was as if these elections were kind of like the holy grail in Libya. Everything hinged and was driven towards the elections. Many argued throughout that year and would say that they were proved correct in arguing so, that having such a narrow focus on elections and elections at apparently any cost was actually detrimental. So amongst the internationals, we saw most of the international players pretty much singing from the same hymn sheet publicly, all supportive of the idea of elections. But we did see some who very much bought into the idea that was pushed by certain Libyan factions, that there was a greater risk of conflict if elections were delayed, despite those elections happening within a highly contested, as Tariq mentioned earlier, legal framework, that there was a greater risk of conflict if the elections were delayed than if the elections actually took place. Now, the elections have been delayed and we haven't seen conflict since December 24th. There were other internationals who expressed reservations about that very problematic legal framework that was very much being challenged already in Libya in the run-up to December 24th, the concerns about not having a proper constitutional framework, etc. But pretty much everybody went along with this idea that elections should happen. It was quite notable in the weeks and then days leading up to December 24th. In the days leading up, Russia was the first to actually come out publicly and say, if elections do not happen on December 24th, we don't have a problem with that. We would prefer to have these elections happen in a better context, etc. I think now that a lesson has been learned, that kind of imposing deadlines in Libya, we've seen this consistently since Libya tipped into civil conflict in 2014, imposing deadlines has never worked in the Libyan political process. So now I think there's an understanding amongst internationals that it is better to set objectives rather than timeframes and actual deadlines, because if you set deadlines, you risk basically undermining yourself. But just to add to what Tariq said at the earlier and what Lemise has outlined as well, I think what's really important to remember here is, we can talk about the maneuvering both domestically by the Libyan players and also internationally. But I think one key takeaway from December is that 2.8 million Libyans registered for these elections. Of those 2.8, some 2.4 million collected their voting cards in the weeks leading up to December 24th, clearly indicating that they intended to come out on election day. That is a clear message that Libyans want change. They've had the same parliament now for almost 8 years, a highly dysfunctional parliament. They haven't had a government that has been elected in a national election for several years now. So there is a crisis of legitimacy. There's a clear signal from ordinary Libyans that they would like to vote sometime soon. They want change. And I think, you know, as people now strategize in terms of the way forward, that I think should be at the heart of the conversation.
Thank you. And I think that's a really important point on the idea of setting objectives instead of deadlines. And I'm curious for all of you, what do you think those objectives should be? If you could name sort of your top 2 or 3 objectives at this point, what are those? And maybe we'll start with you, Mary, and we'll go the other direction this time.
Well, I think what we've been seeing now in the last couple of weeks in Libya is a push by the House of Representatives, the parliament that has been in place since 2014, and the High State Council based in Tripoli. The two bodies have been at odds with each other over the years, but they seem to be in agreement right now on the need, as they see it, to return to what they call the constitutional process. There are many who are really worried about this turn because Libya has had a draft constitution since 2017. It has not yet been put to a referendum, as is supposed to happen. It has a constitutional declaration that has been in place since 2011 with several amendments since then. There is a real concern that this renewed interest by obviously parties that are interested, many would argue, in maintaining the status quo, in returning to the constitutional process, you're basically tipping Libya into a scenario where there's endless wrangling again over the constitutional issue. So there are some who have basically said that this is merely a delaying tactic by those who want to actually remain in position. I think the challenge for internationals now is how you actually address that and sidestep delaying tactics like that by interested parties in Libya who basically would like to maintain the status quo and prevent at least parliamentary elections for the foreseeable future.
Great, thank you. Over to you, Lemis. What do you see as the main objectives today in Libya?
Well, for me, I think that elections, are essential, and I think that the electoral process has already begun. I'm grateful that that it didn't happen on the 24th of December, because the electoral laws they are there's no consensus about them, and actually they were issued they are flawed laws. And also there is another risk, which is the results. There were no guarantees that results will be accepted, but yet we still have to. There is a vast majority of a 2.5 Libyans, demanding elections, because we have been in the transitional phase for now for a decade. And this transitional phase, we can, if we see or there's a clear indication that in each of these governments, corruption, is increasing more and more, and the livelihoods of normal citizens is deteriorating continuously. So the vast majority of the Libyans, they want to end this cycle, and they want an elected, or the demand is now for an elected government. Also, this parliament and the House of State Council, they have, been entrenching this status quo. So I don't think their concern about a constitution is for the sake of the country. It's just another way to entrench the status quo, and another way they will which will work for them. They are just bickering for their personal interests. Elections are the only way which will lead to renewal of legitimacy and national, and that will lead to stability. I know it's not in the perfect conditions, And but yet, this is our only hope that Libya will be a stabilized nation. We need to, now that the electoral process has begun, and the roadmap, and still, we still have a few months more. I think it would be a real drawback if we spoil this and allow, House of State Council or House of Representatives to delay it to come out with a new constitution, which is their new approach. So elections, the electoral laws can be amended, and a constitutional base can be agreed on. I think we need to think about ways to move forward about these elections. This is what I think. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm over to Tarek, but just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll start getting to those in 1 second here. So over to you, Tarek. What do you see as the main objectives?
Thanks. In terms of the main objective, I'm going to be a bit unoriginal here, but just to emphasize on how important this issue is, and to say it's to get the electoral process back on track. As Dr. Ben Saad said very powerfully, the current elite are using the opportunity presented by the postponement of election day to try to divert everybody's attention towards valid problems like the constitution or the lack of legitimacy of the interim government, but ones that are disingenuously being put forward and being exploited for their own personal gain. And the only way to really not get sucked into these diversionary tactics is to keep the eye on the prize, so to speak, to keep the focus on elections, and to try to learn from the lessons of the past year and have a more substantive approach towards elections. So, breaking down what exactly is needed to get to a credible vote, renewing an electoral law, an appeals process and a vetting process for candidates, a real mandate for the government and what's coming next, putting all of these on paper, pointing out who's responsible for what, and then trying to push that plan forward. For a second objective, I'll go a bit left field and say that Libya is in desperate need of a national reconciliation process, and is also in a kind of awkward position whereby no institution in Libya is capable of hosting a national reconciliation process because they're all conflict actors. So, after 10 years of various civil wars, of horrific levels of corruption, of human rights abuses, the destruction of an entire nation, if Libya is to actually move forward elections or not, it needs a national reconciliation program. It needs a national healing and almost like that constitutional process to decide where to go next. And I think it will need international support and assistance in order to get there, given how highly compromised all of Libya's political actors and even the judiciary currently are. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Some of the questions that have started to come in, and one, there's sort of a theme on this sort of next round of leaders. And so maybe I'll have you address this first, Tarek, and then others are welcome to come in as well. But do you think, is there a place for a new crop of Libyan leaders to replace leaders currently in positions of power? And I think similarly, will the current GNU prime minister step down if the House of Representatives chooses to replace him? Who is the likely replacement? So sort of a broader question on who is the next generation of Libyan leaders, and is there space for that?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, to work backwards here, in terms of who a rival government or a replacement for the current prime minister might be, unfortunately, it's not from any new source. It'll be a familiar face from the existing political elite, because as we were saying in response to the last question, it's being advanced for disingenuous reasons. And I don't think we'll see anybody, not the current government nor the parliament, leave their positions or be able to be forced from their positions without a democratic mandate given to their replacement. And I would say, after 10 years of recycling the same political class, Libya, there's not just room for a new crop of leaders, there is a desperate need for them to come in and kind of replace this geriatric order of old men who are dominating Libya's political landscape. Where these can come from is anybody's guess, but I think the best route towards them is to try to be a bit creative with an electoral law, with a vetting process which is moral and based on ethical standards and traditional legal standards, which would help to remove some of the some of the existing crop of leaders who all have tremendous amounts of baggage after the last 10 years. Thanks.
Mary or Lamise, would either of you like to come in on this question? No? Oh, sorry, both. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Lamise, and then I'll turn to you, Mary.
All right. I would like to add to what Tara just said now. It is indeed a cycle of recycling, the same political figures. And now, it's not a secret that Libya's file now is more like there is international intervention. So I think there are some of the European capitals are backing, the formation of another government, and some of the regional actors are also backing this. But whether this gets, recognition from the Security Council, the question is still there. So this is why, this is another important reason why elections need to take place. We can't keep recycling, the same politicians, even if one of them wins in the upcoming elections. Let's say if elections occur, it is still a strong, concrete building stone on the way to democracy. At least we are paving the way to democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary, to you.
Well, one thing that I think was striking in the run-up to December 24th was some voices, Libyan voices that had been clamoring for elections and warning that if elections were delayed, we would see renewed conflict. Once certain candidates were cleared by the courts to run in the presidential election, many of those voices started becoming distinctly lukewarm about elections and arguing that the elections should be paused, the time was not right, etc. So there was a sense that people, yes, were pushing for change, but the kind of change that they wanted to see. When other figures were in the mix, amongst them Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, but also Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh, the current prime minister, who had made a pledge not to run for election and then overlooked that. When those two candidates were cleared to run, the conversation started changing. And I think on the question of Saif al-Islam, I see Graham has asked a question on that. That was such a big question in terms of how much support he might get in a presidential election. And, if Saif al-Islam was to be a candidate, in many ways, it would be something of a referendum on the past decade in Libya. And, the so-called green current, meaning those who, were sympathetic to the former regime, in many respects in today's Libya, it's an unknown quantity. They've never been tested politically. So people can project things onto them. People can claim that the green current is a very significant proportion of the Libyan population. Others will claim the opposite. We simply don't know. I think that if Saif al-Islam Gaddafi were to stand in a future election in Libya, of course, he would be able to draw on that support base that never really shifted from supporting his father's regime. as well as that cohort of Libyans who in 2011 were pretty much ambivalent about the uprising against Gaddafi. And then I think what would be very interesting is to see amongst those Libyans who supported the uprising in 2011, but have been very disappointed with the decade that has followed, how many of them would actually vote for somebody like Saif al-Islam Gaddafi? So these are all questions for a future election. And of course, if Saif al-Islam Gaddafi wants to run again and is cleared to run. But I think these are questions that basically point to a very changed political landscape in Libya in the future if somebody like Saif al-Islam or somebody else who is representative of that so-called green current runs in a presidential election. But also how the question of how the green current could do in a parliamentary election as well, I think is worth bearing in mind.
Great, thank you. Tarek, do you have anything to add on the Saif al-Islam question of sort of how plausible his candidacy is and where his potential support base could come from?
I think Mary covered it quite well, but I suppose it's kind of a damning indictment of how far Libya's revolution has come, that the conversation on the election 10 years after it started is on whether Gaddafi's son is going to come back and be president. And it also shows how out of ideas Libya's political class is. If there is nothing new to be discussed, if there isn't anything forward-looking, to the extent that the hopeful candidate for many outside Tripoli, for more traditional bases in the south, and for those who simply had it better before the revolution, is to back the failed reformist of the Gaddafi clan. Because it's a long shot to say that a guy who couldn't reform the state when Daddy was the dictator is going to be able to do it in the current chaos and division of today. But I don't think that you see any of the lot who are an overwhelmingly popular candidate and who have a more powerful constituency within Libya than outside Libya. And I think that's the most damning indictment of these elections.
Question for Lamis. Is the LPDF still functional and calling the shots in terms of the continuing mandate of the GNU?
We have been invited by Stephanie Williams for two meetings I've attended with her. One was a small meeting, it was like a consultative meeting with members here from the west side, because she's now in Tripoli, and we have been also I have been also invited the women's blog with Ansmil, with Stephanie Williams, but we haven't received any formal, meeting yet. Speak to you transparently, I think there is no way out from. I mean, if we are going now to have elections, and if the electoral laws are going to be amended, or if there is any kind of consensus to be approved, I certainly, we've been watching, the HOR, the House of State Council, all of these parties, we've been watching them for a while, and we know they are playing games. I certainly don't think that they will come out with a solution for these elections. And I only think the way out would be more mediation between all of these parties, more dialogue. Maybe LPDF needs to be reformed. Maybe it needs to be more inclusive. Maybe more figures need to be invited to attend, a more inclusive forum. And all parties, even the armed groups, I think they need to be invited, and we need to come out with an agreement. There needs to be firm public guarantees that accepts of elections are to be the results of elections. They are going to be accepted, and also the framework needs to be agreed on. So unless everyone is invited, this is more, inclusive, civil society actors, whatever parties, unless everyone is there, everyone is represented, there will be no way out. We can't depend on bodies which have interest to come out with a solution for our country. Thank you.
Question for you, Mary. What exactly is Stephanie Williams' mandate, since she is only a special advisor and not the head of UNSMIL?
Well, Stephanie Williams, who was previously the head of the, basically acting head of the US Embassy to Libya, and then deputy to Ghassan Salameh when he was UN envoy, and then acting UN envoy after Ghassan stepped down. She was appointed in mid-December, just in the immediate run-up to the planned election, as special advisor to Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General on Libya. And this was to kind of sidestep issues at the Security Council relating to appointing a new SRSG at the time and appointing Stephanie to that post. And what was really striking was Stephanie immediately traveled to Libya and embarked on a very exhaustive range of meetings across the country with all the key players. And because of her background on Libya and her years of working on Libya, she was immediately able to kind of tap into the dynamics and meet people, etc., knows who to talk to. And, I think this question of, how special advisor compares with, SRSG is an interesting one, but certainly, Libyans have been commenting on how much she's managed to fit in so far in terms of meetings and conversations with key actors, not just in Libya, but also in terms of the external players in Libya. She was in Moscow in recent days. So I think the question a lot of Libyans are asking now is what comes out of this exhaustive round of meetings? So what comes next, and what kind of strategizing happens? Stephanie has publicly said in recent days that she would like to see what she calls an electoral event before the end of June, which is when the current UN roadmap is due to expire. Referring to an electoral event, she didn't talk about parliamentary or presidential elections or both. So it's keeping that kind of open there. But the noises we've been hearing, both from the House of Representatives, but also the head of the Libyan National Election Commission, would indicate that the possible framework here in terms of elections goes beyond June, actually, given also the fact that Ramadan is due to take place in May. So that will kind of slow, or that will disrupt the time frame as well. So quite a challenge in terms of how one works within the current kind of roadmap, if you like, how that roadmap can be amended, and then how you actually deal with the players Lamis and Tarek and I have been talking about so far, in terms of clearly those who see opportunity in this moment, whether by prolonging their lifetime in the case of the House of Representatives and the Higher State Council, or those who are hoping to usurp the current government of national unity. That rumors are swirling in Libya at present about attempts to usurp that current government of Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh and form a new government. So there's a lot kind of cooking in terms of what might happen in the immediate future related to the government of national unity, but then long-term in terms of the electoral framework.
Great, thank you. And a question for you, Tarek. What are the HOR's actual powers in the current political landscape? And does the HCS have to sign off on their decisions?
Sorry, I might have chuckled as you read out that question, because I think for the last 4 or 5 years at least, all of Libya's institutions have been operating under a mantra of to dare is to do, and they'll just get away with whatever they can get away with. I mean, speaking by their technical legal powers, The House of Representatives' inability to make quorum means that it's essentially powerless and should be for the last few years now. But we've progressively moved up the ranks from having a kind of minority house be able to meet and make decisions. And from last September or so, we are now in a position whereby the Speaker of the House, Aguila Saleh, can unilaterally make laws, and they are rubber stamped and considered to be the product of Libya's parliament. So we're going down a disturbing path with the parliament. The High Council of State has similar problems associated with it, and is not necessarily there to sign off on all of the HOR's decisions or laws, but it's supposed to be consulted on various big issues, foreign policy, defense policy, and so on. But it's kind of cut out of the picture, and all of these institutions operate and interact with one another in a very ad hoc way. So, some would call the High Council of State and the House of Representatives rival parliaments at times. But they also work very well together in trying to postpone the electoral process and trying to accumulate more powers in the hands of the two houses. So yeah, it's very little is done on the basis of legal authority, of proper process and due process of any kind. Most of this is unilateralism and seeing what realpolitik and the power of personality politics will afford you in terms of opportunity.
Great, thank you. A question for all of you. It says, each of you have hinted or stated that the current leadership in Libya is driven by the desire to protect their own interests. Is it possible to change this driver? So maybe I'll turn to you first, Lemis. Do you think it's possible to change the interest sort of driven politics in Libya today?
Well, that's a difficult question. Because when we study the behavior of our politicians, they are bickering about their personal interests, and unfortunately these politicians have become like models for others. So it will be really difficult to end this kind of cycle. Yet I hope and I wish that it can be ended. And again, as I said, this ending this kind of cycle can only be if elections will happen. I still believe there is, and I'm optimistic that if their elections will happen, and if somehow we can agree on a framework, an elected government can introduce a new governance reforms that will lead to a more stable kind of government, and it will also help to educate people about proper governance, and along with that, accountability will be there. We will have, a proper law, strong institutions, and this will be the first step to produce also a proper, or let's say, politicians who are loyal to their country. So this is why I am a strong, campaigner and advocator for elections, because I see no way out unless these politicians are moved aside and our people decide or elect a proper a person to rule the country.
Thank you. To you, Mary, I mean, the same question. How do you sort of change the interest-driven politics?
Well, one thing I've been struck by just in recent weeks, thinking of the fact that in June, if parliamentary elections do not take place before June, the House of Representatives will have been in place for 8 years, which is quite extraordinary by any measure, but particularly when one recalls how dysfunctional it has been, and this has been playing out in full view of Libyans. And remembering how in 2014, the House of Representatives' predecessor, the General National Congress, there was actually a very coordinated national campaign by activists who insisted that the GNC, as it was known, the GNC's mandate was due to expire. Others challenged that reading of the framework at that time, but there was a highly coordinated national campaign that brought in media outlets, civil society. There were demonstrations, rallies, etc., to basically pressure the General National Congress to basically accept that its mandate had expired, as these activists had argued. And I think what is quite striking is that we haven't seen anything like that when it comes to the House of Representatives. There have been, and in late 2020, there was a burst of protests across Libya, the biggest protest we've seen actually since 2011, which focused on allegations of corruption, be they within the power centers in eastern Libya or inside Tripoli. But we haven't actually seen a campaign calling on the House of Representatives to basically get serious about elections, etc. There have been, there were just a few days ago, there was a small protest in the eastern town of Tobruk where the House of Representatives sits. There are other protests, I understand, planned for this Friday, but it's been very piecemeal. And I think that kind of indicates as well the level of fatigue on the part of Libyans at this point. There was still in 2014 that energy that you had remaining from 2011, particularly that energy at civil society level where people felt that they could go out on the streets, protest, demonstrate, and people would listen to them, that they could instigate change in that way. I think now a real fatigue has set in. But also I would add, throughout the last 8 years of Libya's conflict, there's been an ongoing conversation about what sticks and carrots you use with intransigent Libyan actors, be they military or political actors. And, every so often the question of sanctions comes up. And if you look at Aguila Saleh, who's the Speaker of the House of Representatives, he was slapped with European sanctions a number of years ago. But as many people noted, soon after he was being invited all around Europe. So, we've seen sanctions being imposed and then not really taken seriously. So those targeted by sanctions tend not to take sanctions very seriously. So I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation. And there are some who would argue that sanctions still need to be and should be tried in Libya, and others who would say that they actually end up undermining a process rather than helping it.
Thank you. To you, Tarek, the same question, but then also there's another question here, a little bit related on the sort of three big fish, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, Dbeibeh, and Haftar are all plausible candidates. Can you ban all three or run all three, and what kind of vetting might work in the elections?
Thanks. And yeah, the two questions and my answers to the two are kind of interlinked, because so the first, I would say that no, I mean you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You can't teach an even older Libyan politician to stop thieving after all these years, probably, if it's not too politically incorrect to say. But we have seen demonstrable evidence that you can shame these politicians, you can hassle them internally, and you can internationally coerce them into moving forward with what is considered to be the appropriate political process for Libya. And the most recent example for this is how the first time that the House of Representatives made quorum in years was to meet to approve the government and the appointment of Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh as Prime Minister. And all three of those elements came into forcing the MPs to all convene and to vote according to what was considered necessary for the political process to continue. But I think going forward, we have this problem whereby, and it's not unique to Libya, but we venerate personality politics, and personality politics dominates the Libyan scene. It is why, in response to the last question as well, I say that they all kind of operate under a mantra of to dare is to do. And it's kind of baked into what we hope for from this election, or this idea of the big three, that one of these personalities can win and then they will, leave Libya in their own image. But the only way that Libya is going to break out of its cycle is to move from personality politics to what Dr. Ben Saad was hinting at in terms of systemic politics, or having rule of law, having something predictable, having a system in place that governs and decides everything. So even in response to that question of the big three, I would say that even if you apply similar vetting standards in Libya that you have in any other democracy or any other established rule of law, then all three of those would be banned. And as long as it's done through a systemic process and a clear legal process, which is considered to be fair and just and not politically targeted at any one of the three, then I think that, okay, their diehard supporters may bicker and may kick up a fuss, but there is enough of an overwhelming environment of support behind a fair and just electoral process that they wouldn't be able to get away with tanking the whole process. So if we try to keep a focus and try to manufacture something which is based on a system, then that's the best hope for going forward. Otherwise, we're going to get ourselves painted into a very awkward corner, if I'm not torturing too many different analogies at the same time.
Great, thank you. Another question in the chat, and maybe Tariq, I'll turn to you first on this one as well. Do you see any progress made in the reunification of the military? How do you evaluate the work done so far by the JMC? Are the recent meetings between the chiefs of staff of the rival factions a sign of hope or something to build upon?
There is some signals of hope from the creation of the JMC in the first instance, but I think since then it's been relatively predictable, whereby, instead of focusing on the big issues that need to be resolved, such as unifying the country's military and finding a way to move from this, the technical security experts call it a hybrid system. The rest of us would just say like a system dominated by militias, into something more formal and systemic. They've kind of shirked away from those responsibilities and instead decided to focus on other tasks which can be sold as being important, but are ultimately just distractions from these two main overarching problems which need to be resolved. There were months of negotiations over how to reopen the coastal road, which ties, which spans the breadth of Libya, which is great and it's important to have open and it's lovely to see open, but it's not as big an issue or an important an issue as reunifying the country's military. And within that joint military commission, you see a microcosm of many of the problems that Libya has. So, none of these 10 people are really decision makers in their own right. You would say that the 5 from Western Libya do not really have control or a large impact over the military scene of Western Libya. And the 5 from Eastern Libya, some of them aren't even military officers, and they're all lackeys of Khalifa Haftar and unable to make decisions in their own right. And so it's not really a forum where these fundamental issues, such as, the divergence in the makeup of the state between the perceptions of Haftar and the perceptions of others can be resolved, let alone moved forward. So sorry to burst the bubble. I started on an optimistic note, but as ever, there's a mixture of the two.
Thank you. I think our final question here is for Mary. Do you believe the Russians and Egyptians are sincere in supporting the political process, or if their Libyan partners defect from the electoral results or from the elections entirely, will they defect with them?
Well, I think given that the prospect of elections now is very much open-ended, the hope is something within the next 6 to 8 months. The Electoral Commission has said that 6 to 8 months is the time frame required before elections could take place. But in fact, we all know it's very much open-ended, the idea that elections could take place. So what's interesting is we've started to see the language of stability creep into the conversation on Libya among some external players. Amid also a lot of talk, a lot of rumors about certain external players encouraging all kinds of deals, including a possible deal between Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh, the prime minister in Tripoli right now, and Khalifa Haftar. There's talk of other external players perhaps supporting the idea, going back to what Lemi said earlier, supporting this idea of a new government of national unity to replace the current one in Tripoli. Russia and Egypt have not really kind of declared their hand either way right now, but figures, of course, continue to travel to Cairo, in particular for meetings, some also going to Moscow. But I think generally there is kind of a sense that amongst the external players, the idea of return to armed conflict anytime soon is something that no one really has the desire or appetite for. And I think one lesson that has been learned in recent years is that, you know, Khalifa Haftar, his ambitions and the external players that were indulging those ambitions for so long, including Russia and Egypt, you know, a lot of their kind of idea of Haftar collapsed with his defeat in Tripoli in 2020. So a lot of those narratives about what could have been the solution to Libya were essentially, they collapsed, and new kind of ideas about stabilizing Libya had to emerge. And many of those ideas are more about kind of deal making as opposed to having somebody come out on top as a potential strongman. Because right now, I don't think there's anyone in the Libyan space that looks like a potential strongman. I mean, many people would argue that Haftar didn't really fit that mold. He was a wannabe strongman for many years, and as strong as his external friends actually made him on the ground. I think those days are largely gone, and now it's essentially about deal making, including for Russia and Egypt.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I know there are more questions out there. I apologize to those of you who we did not get to, but let me turn it over to Graham to close us out.
Hi, just a thank you from me, first for everyone for joining us today. A great audience turnout and some really interesting questions, and a special thank you first to Sarah, our moderator, and then to our panelists, Tariq, Lemis, and Mary, for some very interesting perspectives on what's happening in Libya right now. Really grateful for your contributions. Stay tuned for other Middle East Policy Forum events. We'll have a couple more coming this semester, dealing with Tunisia, looking at the World Cup in Qatar. So stay tuned. Yeah, we look forward to seeing you again.